at the political level. I do think that you're definitely right. One of the biggest challenges we had from the outset, we didn't want to just focus on military stuff in absence of kind of the political environment in which these military options are generated. And we wrestled for a long time with how do we kind of overcome some of these social and political challenges that exist. One of the works that we came across that we found influential and seemed to resonate with some of our own experiences and interviews, especially with people kind of on the ground, is this idea that actually identity is already shifting. So J. Michael Cole has this great book out, Convergence or Conflict, where he makes, I think, a very apt point that in some respects the parties have completely missed the boat on this, that indeed there really isn't a debate over national identity anymore. It's consolidating around a unique Taiwanese identity. To be sure, that's influenced by fears, certainly in how people are going to report in public opinion polls. They're strategic actors. They recognize the more that China senses identity is shifting away, it's going to change perceptions of the status quo and perhaps provoke things. But that this is happening kind of regardless, and that the parties, if they're astute actors, are going to catch on to this, and then soon enough we're going to see kind of convergence. So in some respects, we think that this problem is kind of, for this challenge of how you would build identity, is kind of self-solving, and in many ways we're trying to harness what's been already happening on the ground, and we think that the parties will come to see the benefit of that. Also, I think this speaks to the fifth point about the, well, we want to make sure China thinks that there's some long-term outcome which kind of works in its benefit, and therefore it won't attack, and so Taiwan can take these kind of half measures towards deterrence, I guess, which somehow won't be provocative, but also won't deter. Here are the challenges if J. Michael Cole is right, and some, again, the anecdotal evidence that we saw when we were in Taiwan seems to suggest he's onto something. If there's a profound long-term shift in national identity, one that's driven by generational shifts and all sorts of other things that structural we can't really influence, then that already kind of precludes the option of China thinking that this window of opportunity will remain open indefinitely. So if at some point China recognizes, and I'm sure the rest of the world is already sensing it as well, that social identity is now converging around this sense of Taiwanese uniqueness and identity, then at some point, again, the clock starts to tick, and the Chinese are more likely to say, we're not going to be able to deal with this indefinitely, we need to resolve it quickly before the military options are in place that would prevent us from doing so. Your second question is, why has Taiwan persisted in pursuing this sort of very symmetric approach, despite the fact that CSBA and others have been writing quite extensively about these asymmetric options? I think this is a fascinating question, and I don't want to speak for Matt and the other team members who aren't here, but that's probably what occupied most of our kind of downtime in between interviews. Is I think for PhD students and prospective PhD students, I think there are dissertations to be written about this question. It's profoundly, I think, social and psychological. We attempt to get at it from the strategic angle, talking about costs. You bring up a really interesting and important point about who benefits from the status quo. One of the things we try to do, and particularly in the fourth chapter, and Joe kind of spearheaded this effort, is think through ways that shifting from buying high-end weapons or indigenously producing them towards these kind of asymmetric options can still be done in a way that benefits weapons producers. And in some ways, we think that because IDS, the Indigenous Diesel Submarine Project, and Aegis-like capabilities are so difficult, even for American weapons makers, that in some ways you're kind of wasting money to build them. There's a lot of inefficiencies and lessons that are going to have to be learned, that Taiwan and its weapons production capabilities are better suited to semi-submersibles, autonomy, and all sorts of sort of next generation asymmetric weapons. And this can be an enormous producer of profit for these industries. And so we think that there are ways to frame this and indeed to create benefits for people.
No, this is great feedback. Really appreciate it. As far as the feasibility in relation to political polarization, I wish I had an answer. I have not, prior to this project, had not spent a lot of time on thinking about researching Taiwan. I did not realize the level of polarization until I got over there. I thought we were a politically polarized country until we landed in Taipei. So building that consensus is it's a question I don't really have an answer to right now, but would love to see further research on. As far as why they continue to pursue, why Taiwanese military continues to pursue their current defense priorities, a lot of it I do think is caught up in the identity of the military being that they still see themselves as a major power in a lot of ways, and they want to be a major power military, and that means having high-end capabilities. There was somebody we spoke to there, I forget exactly which meeting was, mentioned that was a pilot used to talk about just being able to fly his F-4 down the Chinese mainland coastline. Didn't have to worry about air defenses, and now that's completely impossible. There was another Taiwanese strategic studies professor who talked about the idea of when he had recommended preparation for urban warfare. And I stopped and asked, well, we've talked to a number of people who have said that this is something they're preparing for, and he said they're preparing to fight Stalingrad and Taipei. I'm talking about an urban insurgency. So I think there is an idea of something that's caught up in the identity of the military and the KMT, I think, too, since the military is so tightly closely related to the Blue Coalition, of the idea of Taiwan being China, and being China means having a military with high-end systems that mirrors a major power. There was, when we spoke with some of the some members of the Legislative Yuan on the defense committees, there was also a notion that a number of us picked up on, an idea that Taiwan that for these legislators at least, an idea of wanting to still be in the U.S. camp, still be part of, still not see themselves as any as being inferior to, say, South Korea or Japan in terms of the relationship with the United States. And I think that's where you see a lot of the desire for an F-35 come from. So how you get past that, I study military innovation. I'm very sympathetic to the idea of inter-service competition being a spark for innovation. The problem here is that because of the political polarization, you'd be looking at something where you probably have to create new defense organizations, new military organizations, and with DPP in power, if you have one that's related to the DPP, one that's KMT, you're looking at a very bad situation there. So.
With that cheerful note,
Yeah, that's what
we're open for questions. Comments, questions, please identify yourself first, and then try to be concise with your comments. And the gentleman over here, please.
Hi, thank you. Steve Winters, independent consultant. I wonder if you could answer some criticisms of this idea of the insurgency. I see you actually touch on it in the book. But first, it's obvious you can't really have a functioning government if it doesn't have any money. And since so much of the resources now of Taiwan are invested in the mainland, the first thing that's going to happen is the mainland is going to seize all those resources. And secondly, the Taiwanese government is dependent on the money they're getting from export, as an exporting country. And the exports are not going to be leaving the island because it'll be some kind of blockade from the Chinese. And then thirdly, the issue of the North Korea would be the perfect example of a nation that's currently prepared for decades-long insurgency if everything else goes down the tubes. But there you've got totally unified population. Secondly, they've been independent of a lot of stuff coming in. So it seems to me that it's an appealing idea, but I just think it's not going to work for this whole variety of reasons.
And also, the Chinese Communist Party would like to claim they're the strategic god coming to insurgency. So they have had a lot of experience, but that date a long time ago.
No, so this is an excellent question, and in the review process, our reviewers pushed us very much in this direction. These are the responses, and we've thought a great deal about all these excellent points. In terms of what's going to happen when the inevitable blockade comes and basically isolate, right? Taiwan is an island. It's not like North Korea. It doesn't have land borders. There are a few answers here. One is Taiwan is an island. It's a really big island. So I think, and Easton's done a lot of great work on this, I think it's militarily infeasible to think that China is going to literally isolate, complete vacuum seal, put a dome over the island to make it impossible to get things in, right? Asymmetry works in all sorts of ways. Asymmetry also works in order to run blockades. So you can have traditional blockade runners. You can also have asymmetric options such as drones and things that fly and go undersea, which if you lose them, you don't care, that are delivering supplies and armaments to the insurgents. Similarly, this is one of the reasons we think a lot of writing about territorial defense, and this includes in places like the Baltic region, is a bit fanciful. It assumes that insurgency is just something you say, you give a manual, and then people will kind of rise. That's not how it works, right? It defies all sorts of collective action challenges. This is why we think Taiwan needs to lay the foundation now. And part of this foundation is a very practical foundation of stockpiling equipment, food, and supplies, and then dispersing them across the country such that you create a massive targeting problem. Which gets to the next piece. To be sure, a large number, if not a majority of the population, will not support an insurgency. And we don't think civilians should be running, raids on T-72 tanks. We think that with 2.5 million reservists, if even a tiny fraction of those actually take up arms and start fighting, right? The United States was held down by between 5,000 and 20,000 insurgents in Iraq in the opening stages of that conflict. And the logic of insurgency, as the United States knows in its own revolutionary period when large numbers of Americans supported the British, right? The logic of insurgency is to provoke overreaction, which then causes sympathy for your side, both at home and abroad. Because ultimately, right, time will be on China's side if this is the way it goes. The idea is to, before the fact, raise the prospect that this thing's going to last forever, and raise the prospect that the international community is going to intervene, either in terms of materially supporting the insurgency, if only to tie down China so it can impose costs elsewhere, or perhaps to intervene in a militarily and a clear way. The last point is, I think there's a really strong assumption that the Chinese have mastered counterinsurgency, right? Mao wrote on guerrilla warfare. It's interesting. So after the Gulf War, China wakes up and recognizes, right, there's this new revolution in military affairs and then begins copying the United States, and has therefore put tremendous emphasis on adopting the exact types of tactics, techniques, procedures, and weapons that make them terrible at fighting insurgency. So you can't have it all ways. Opportunity costs face top-rate militaries. The U.S. military deals with it. We realized this in Iraq. I was there on the front wave, and we were very good at conventional operations, but when we had to transition to counterinsurgency, we weren't very good at it. It took years of learning. I think I'm pretty confident in saying the PLA would run into the exact same problem, which, as we talk about in the report, then leaves them with two options. Either they double down on using the PLA to fight the insurgency, which in many ways will just exacerbate the insurgency, or they pull their pacification forces from already restive regions and send them over. By the way, now the international community might be trying to interdict those forces, sink them. They'll be fighting guerrillas on land. That's not what they're dealing with in Tibet and elsewhere right now. And that then creates vulnerabilities for China. And the Chinese leadership will have to make the decision, are we willing to trade these restive provinces within the kind of contiguous Chinese country in order to deal with this kind of never-ending problem in Taiwan?
It almost reminds me of the what's currently going on in Xinjiang with re-education camps to relocate a vast number of the Uyghur population and re-educate them. And that's not only created a PR disaster, but also how to end that that development, how to put an end to that policy is tremendously problematic. So moving on, the gentleman over here, please.
Eric Gomez from Cato, and I worked with Eric Gopner, who was one of the co-authors on this while he was visiting scholar at Cato. And we had a lot of discussions after he got back about this, because it's something I track too. I'm curious to hear, Matt and Mike, from y'all's perspective, when you guys were over there interviewing people, what did you see as the sort of big blockage here to adopting this kind of thinking? Is it sort of a political issue? Is it a military leadership issue? Because like Scott said, yeah, if you look back, 10 years, I think the earliest that I read was 10 years ago with the Porcupine Strategy by William S. Murray. It's like, yeah, Americans have been telling this to the Taiwanese for a long time, and it's taken them a long time to actually even take half steps towards this effort. And it seems like if that's the big threat, then it should be more acute. So curious what you guys saw in your interviews as like the big limiting factor here on moving towards this outlook.
You asked if it's military, political. I think the answer is yes. Yes. It's, yeah, I mean, you have, like I said, the military and KMT are pretty much one and the same. You have DPP, comes up out of the democracy movement. Somewhat, in some ways, resentful of the military due to the martial law period, has less experience in that field. So you have this lack of consensus about what you're supposed to be doing. And then you have, like I said, you have you have a strong organization with a strong identity about what they think it's supposed to be. One of the things we also ran into is there are other political questions when we spoke with some American experts who had interviewed members of the military, they also talked about the way the population reacts to the military. It's not very popular over there. So one, and this is purely anecdotal, was the idea that when helicopters go up for training, people end up calling the government and saying it's too loud, that people in those areas, and that the government will shut down training exercises. So you don't have an opportunity to get to learn about what you're doing and then to actually try to make changes to it. You don't have a lot of popular support for, so the military is just kind of left on its own to do what it wants to do. And what it wants to do is what it's been doing for decades now.
Be a U.S. one.
Yes.
And if I could just toss in very quickly on that, I also think we shouldn't let the United States off the hook, right? With friends like these, the United States has been somewhat schizophrenic in how it makes its recommendations. So you have think tanks and random U.S. universities saying go asymmetric, and at the same time you have a lot of push from the United States government to purchase these high-end weapon systems. I was part of the AAV sales package in the early 2000s, and that was quite beneficial for the armor community in the military, which was trying to rebuild a lot of its armor and used the Taiwanese money to do so. And so it is difficult, and there are incentives, and you're getting very mixed messages. And I definitely sense frustration on the part of many Taiwanese leaders that the United States is saying one thing and then turning around and saying something very different. And you know, these have huge lags. You can't just turn overnight on these types of things.
And when you have when your training and doctrine is in many ways, when you have advisors going over there that are telling you a certain way to train, you're going to continue to train that way.
So then a two-finger on this. Do you think that there is Do you think that there is a tension between this sort of focus on interoperability or looking like the U.S. that the U.S. has for not only Taiwan, but a lot of its partners in Asia, and effective deterrence against China? And that, do you think that there's a risk of saying, if you look too much like us, you also are building in the vulnerabilities that the Chinese military is trying really hard to exploit, and it probably will end up burning you if this ever goes hot?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think a division of labor of some sort is much better than just trying to be, a junior partner who looks exactly like the senior partner.
Well, Scott, I want to ask for your opinion on this question, because you raised a question as for who benefits from the status quo.
I don't know.
in
I was just
Taiwan.
raising. Yeah, this,
I'm
it was.
curious.
It was
Doesn't
a
have to
sincere
answer the
question. I'm
question.
curious, right? Like, I mean, I buy. Like, I think that there are all of these factors. I suspect that there are economic factors at play. I buy the psychology kind of thing. Like, I mean, I could imagine if you're like a general in the Air Force, you want F-35s because all generals want
Yeah.
fancy planes to fly around,
want
right?
an F-35.
And if you're in the Navy, you want, right? Yeah. So like, yeah. So you have this, and
When
the-
it works, when it works.
yeah, and I think that in order to kind of change these attitudes, right, like what you don't have in Taiwan is you don't have like kind of, and this is kind of gets into the polarization thing. There's no like consensus on like what's the big threat here? What's like how do we deal with it, right? It's not like Korea, where at least there's some consensus as to kind of what the threat that's being faced is. Like there might be differences into how to deal with it, but right, like so I guess or how realistic the threat is. So I don't know. So I think that the problem is multifaceted, and I think that there's probably also kind of a U.S. kind of coming back to this point, right? Like, and especially I could imagine like far be it from me to be cynical about the current administration, but like look at the response to the Saudi Arabia, right? Like kind of referring to the number of jobs that are going to be lost if we stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia as being one of the first reactions to kind of the possibility of punishing a U.S. ally. And so there's kind of a transactional approach, and that might kind of feed into what Taiwanese officials think is the best way to kind of maintain the support of this U.S. administration.
And I think there's a twofold problem there. One is, yes, absolutely the idea that, with the idea that we get defense jobs here by selling them our systems, and also by developing high-end systems there is a belief, President Tsai has said, she believes that they'll be able to create more jobs and stimulate their economy through some marginal increases in defense spending, which research here by the economists has shown doesn't really have that kind of effect. It's too small of a sector, and that there's deadweight losses from trying to from that kind of government spending, especially when it's at that small of a percentage of GDP. So.
Agree. Mike, please. Mike has been advising the Taiwan program here at Stimson, so thank you very much, Mike.
Mike Fonte, I'm the director of the DPP's mission here in Washington. Thanks, very rich conversation and a lot to poke at. I guess one thing I want to talk a bit about is political polarization. There's no doubt that there is a blue camp and a green camp, no doubt about that. But I think when I listened, at least, you made it sound like, well, the blue camp wouldn't really want to defend Taiwan so much, while the green camp would. I think defending the ROC is in everybody's interest, okay? So the military people, by and large in the past, have been KMT related. Yes, that's understandable. But I don't think that makes them unwilling, for example, to put energy into defending the ROC on Taiwan. It's a distinction which I think has an important difference. The other side of, another part of this question is the question of how traditionally Chinese culture look at military. And it's true, if you asked in traditional China what you'd like your son to do, down at the very, very bottom would be a soldier, right? So, but I think, again, President Tsai, the administration has tried to boost the image of the military. You see her christening boats and sending people off and all those good things that you have to do. But it's an important message. And I think that's where the Taiwanese identity, another question. I mean, you raised so many questions I would love to talk more about, but Taiwanese identity, I think, is real, okay? But what is the reality and who buys into that reality? I think those are important questions. If you stay in Taipei long enough, you might not hear as much as if you go to Kaohsiung, which is another. So a whole bunch of questions involved in this political polarization. What does it really mean? They're fight like heck for winning elections, but I think they'd also fight like heck to defend this place called Taiwan, ROC Taiwan. Another thing, again, so much to talk about, but certainly in my conversations, our conversations with U.S. administration people, the emphasis of the bigger, stronger porcupine, the quills have to be sharper and deeper and all that stuff. The defense industry's folks here, of course, want to sell big platforms. I'm not so sure the administration is behind that per se. I mean, there are different voices. Anyhow, I really appreciate your comments, but I do think that what's happening inside that bubble, which is called Taiwan, is complicated, but not as complicated as, oh, these people want this and these people want that, and there's no convergence in their presentations.
Yeah, and didn't want to make it seem like the KMT was not interested in defending Taiwan. And we met with KMT party officials and with members of the military, and everybody was on the same page there, regardless of political polarization. And even, I think some of the KMT officials did acknowledge exactly what you said about President Tsai trying to boost the image of the military within her own coalition as well. So, no, there was no question there, and I didn't want to give the impression that things were so polarized that the military, because they were closely related to one coalition, was unwilling to defend. Yeah.
The gentleman in the corner.
Oh, great. Thank you. Tremendously interesting discussion. My name's George Hutchinson. I'm a Shar Public Policy PhD student. I'm also the managing editor for the International Journal of Korean Studies. So I tend to focus mainly on Korea issues, but clearly Taiwan is, anything that goes on in that area, one sort of seems to affect the other, has been that way. My question is this. I know this pops the lid off of, it's antithetical to go down the non-proliferation route. But it would seem, Taiwan has an advanced nuclear energy capability. I think they process highly enriched uranium. It would seem that it would be strategically and politically almost beneficial for Taiwan to consider developing nuclear weapons, not only for defense, but also as leverage and sort of to expose China's passive-aggressive, disingenuous sort of stance with North Korea. And I just wanted to get the panel's opinion on that.
So, in the beginning, one of our framing assumptions or scope conditions, I guess, as you will say, is that, we're dealing specifically with conventional deterrence options. At the very end of the report, in our conclusion chapter, we do very briefly revisit this question about nuclear weapons, because it is possible to read the report or just do some basic study on the challenge and say that this is insurmountable. So your only option is to go the nuclear option. We, I think, unanimously as a team, speaking for the two of us standing here, he can nod in agreement with me, we think that's a terrible idea. And as we try to very briefly, and we think we can briefly dismiss it, these are the challenges. Going nuclear in terms of developing a survivable second strike capability would not be instantaneous. It would take a relative amount of time. We can debate certainly how much. We had Mark Fitzpatrick from IISS come over a couple of years ago and give a presentation, and he wrote a great book 2-3 years ago that suggests it would take Taiwan a number of years to kind of go down this pathway. It could not do so covertly. It's tried twice in the past. Both times it's been discovered, at least one of those times, by the United States, who then put it into the process. So it's virtually impossible in today's highly informationalized environment that Taiwan could do that covertly. Therefore, I think we can all probably agree that if China detected Taiwan was even considering going down this road, it would very much think that the window of opportunity is closing, and that would be that.
Scott, would you agree?
Yeah, I think it's a terrible idea. And the optics of it are terrible, too.
Yeah. It does undercut
Yeah.
this liberal
Yeah.
democracy, vibrant,
It's-
globalized.
And Taiwan's tried it. Like, I mean, Jiang Jingguo had a nuclear program. And it wouldn't, there's no way they'd be able to keep it secret. Like, there's too much. I mean, others can speak to this, but I think that Taiwan's too penetrated by Chinese intelligence. There's just no way.
The gentleman over here.
Good morning, Travis Sharp with CSBA. Start just by congratulating the authors on a fantastic report. It's already being talked about, circulated, it's going to be cited, so this is really going to have an impact.
Thank you.
So the study makes a number of recommendations about Taiwan changing its conventional deterrence posture. And we could imagine that not all those changes are created equal. Some of those changes might have more impacts than others. And I can think of at least two categories where that might be the case. First is in terms of how they impact Chinese perceptions of costliness due to China's historical experience. Some of Taiwan's potential options might have more impact than others. So which of your recommendations do you think might appear particularly costly to China because of its own experience? The second category is some of the potential changes Taiwan could make might appear to be very costly because they create multiple dilemmas for China. In other words, they have other scenarios that they have to think about besides the Taiwan Strait. And so as a result, any Taiwanese investments in these areas might create a situation with China where they couldn't deal with these multiple overlapping scenarios. Could you just assess your recommendations with respect to those two categories? Thanks.
As far as what would be the most effective, what would you prioritize, assuming you couldn't do everything? I'm guessing it would probably be the territorial defense. If the idea is that they need to consolidate political control over the island, the most effective thing you can do is make that the costliest possible thing for them. I think we all have agreed on that over the course of this project. Is just if it is too costly for them to control the territory, then I think that's got to be the priority.
Because that appeals most strongly to China then, that's your argument?
I'm sorry?
Territorial defense is going to have the biggest effect on China's perception.
Yeah, that
That's
if
your argument?
yeah that if they're able to get that if the point of this is for them to consolidate control over Taiwan, to bring it back within China, and they cannot do that, then I think that's got to be the priority, is making sure that they don't believe that they can do that at any acceptable cost.
To this, so two things to add. One is, I think the next up on that line would be any anti-ship cruise missiles, semi-submersibles, naval mines, sexy high-tech naval mines, the type it's trying to purchase right now, and even just dummy mines, because those are really hard to deal with. Those asymmetric capabilities that can be put in littorals, the coastal region, and in the water, I think will impose extremely high costs in terms of just the number of lives lost trying to cross through that. And one thing we've heard kind of repeated conversation both here and over there is, in part because of Chinese culture, in part because of many, many years the one-child policy, that there's going to be a real aversion to absorbing high levels of casualties. And so if you can make it credible, and I think there is a real challenge with the credibility of the Territorial Defense Force for all the reasons that were very aptly pointed out. The next best option, I think everyone knows that mines sink ships. The U.S. experience in '91 proves this. That's going to be a tough nut to crack. And even if you crack it really well, you're still going to lose a lot of troop transport. So I would say that would be the second and very cost-effective and plays to many of Taiwan's defense industry's capabilities and advantages. In terms of creating multiple dilemmas, I mean, we very much were, learning at the feet of, or attempting to learn at the feet of Andrew Marshall, Aaron Freeberg, Stephen Rose, and these kind of competitive strategies. We see this as one of the virtues of the territorial defense force, is that it is extremely cost-effective vis-a-vis these other kind of high-end options. And more than anything else that we've kind of proposed, it creates multiple dilemmas across multiple fronts. So you're trying to, if you're the PLA and you're trying to focus on high-end informationalized type warfare, and now you're fighting this really nasty low-end insurgency, as the U.S. found out in Vietnam, right, at some point then you have to kind of break your forces apart, and so you have these conventional forces which are being hit by guerrillas, and at the same time your unconventional forces are being hit by conventional forces. And then I think most provocatively, there's the challenge of China's going to have to start making decisions about, even if you want to go scorched earth, you need a lot of manpower to do that. You got to get that manpower across the Taiwan Strait, and you got to pull it from somewhere. And if the United States, the international community, is at some point really outraged by what's happening, if it hasn't already decided to intervene, and right by assumption we've taken this out, but we actually think that whether you take it out by assumption or not, this is still the best posture for Taiwan. That then gives the United States all sorts of really interesting opportunities to kind of collaborate in parallel as opposed to being interoperable to impose pain in all sorts of unimaginable ways.
Scott, want to get your thought on that?
So coming back to the question, I think that kind of picking up on the comments I made earlier, I mean, I think that the kind of the most effective way of deterring, and this is kind of, again, I'm speculating here, because I think that it's really important to kind of understand how Beijing kind of thinks about these different costs.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, and that's hard to know. My hunch is that Beijing worries more about kind of the cost of actually attacking and successfully launching an attack, and what the broader impact on China's economy, its standing internationally, these sorts of things, right? And the cost of fighting an insurgency in Taiwan, my hunch is that's not something that's going to deter Beijing from launching an attack against Taiwan. If that's all they have to worry about, that's not going to concern them that much.
Well, and to be sure, and this is an excellent point, and I should have revisited it earlier. Right, to be sure, this is why we say it's a holistic. I think you can implement parts of this, but I don't think you can just say territorial defense force, we're done. Because in part, it's the complementary nature that you are slowly but surely attriting forces that they do have to overcome, and we still think that, like CSBA and others have said, even if you eliminate the territorial defense force, these asymmetric operations as you're trying to cross the Taiwan Strait are just going to pose much higher costs than a few Aegis-like destroyers or 8 submarines, which can be relatively easily neutralized.
Yeah, I think that's very compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the corner.
Yeah, Jordan Cohen, PhD student at George Mason. So this may be a little bit outside of the scope of the project, but the U.S. has every incentive to help Taiwan and China avoid war, because if there's war, you're faced with the choice between legitimacy versus going to war and getting entrapped with China over what's effectively an island. So is there anything the U.S. could do to help Taiwan achieve kind of this strategy? Or what should the U.S. do?
I mean, so for one thing, we could have a more unified message and perhaps throttle back on some of the higher end weapon sales. I think that the United States, and speaking a bit out of my area of expertise here, but coming from my military background and understanding of military history, the United States does have a really pathological tendency to go to other countries and try to recreate itself in its own image. We see this playing out right now. Rand and others have talked about this. Take your reserve command and turn it into our operational reserve. I'm here to say I don't think our operational reserve model works all that well. I certainly don't think Taiwan ought to adopt it. I don't think the United States, and it has a much smaller reserve force than Taiwan does, could mobilize all of its reservists in a 30-day time window. And if we expect that there's, in Easton has written, there's about a 30-day warning period that Taiwan can kind of expect at a minimum, one can only imagine trying to mobilize 2.5 million reservists along those lines to augment active duty forces. So I think the United States does, however, have decades of experience fighting insurgencies now, which means you kind of understand insurgency probably to a much greater degree than you understand conventional warfare. U.S. is necessarily focusing on great power conflict, but I think there's a lot of repository of excellence and expertise that the United States could send over and help kind of begin this type of training so as to make it more credible. I wholeheartedly agree. Territorial defense force is not something you can unleash in a glossy manual and say we're done. It's going to have to be demonstrated repeatedly, and the U.S. is going to have to put some real effort to showing that's effective.
Great. There's a question in the front.
Hi, I'm Scott Cuomo. I'm a U.S. Marine. Oh, this work? All right, Mike, great to see you again.
Good to see you.
I'm a U.S. Marine infantry guy, a fair amount of amphib experience, so I found the monograph fascinating because I think, like Ian's book, it does a great job of laying out the realities of how hard it really is to put 500,000 people on landing craft and move 90 miles across very difficult seas. That is often kind of magically 500,000 or 600,000 people showed up. And so I think it's great. But my question is to the first overriding assumption that you made on U.S. policy. And I wonder if that's changing. And I'll explain, perhaps why. And then, if yes, would be the question to you guys, would that make your recommendations even more appealing than they are? So if we were to so if I understood the assumption number one, overarching, was that U.S. policy would still remain kind of unclear, would kind of go, okay. So I think that is changing. And so if there's anything, we are very polarized right now in our country. I think as the days go on, we are more bipartisan in that China is a problem. Like as every day goes on across both parties, and that's our tech companies being called before and Senator Warner reading, like that wouldn't have happened 4 years ago. The INF Treaty, a lot of it's been focused on the N in INF and Europe. If you really unpacked it, it's probably about the conventional land-based missiles challenging shipping in Asia. And then the NDS is overarching what you guys are proposing. It's a deterrence by denial. I mean, so if U.S. policy continues along that track, do you think that that will help with all of your recommendations? For example, perhaps the Marine Corps wouldn't say buy more AAVs or ACVs or and get capabilities that enable you to execute the deterrence by denial. So that's, again, awesome. Thank you very much.
No, great to see you again, too. And very good question. So I think there are two reasons we adopted that assumption. The first was just as a purely intellectual exercise to go down the worst-case scenario kind of path. We used that assumption because really a worst-case scenario would be no U.S. intervention. The second reason is one of the things that makes our project unique is that we had this collaboration across multiple universities, and all of us kind of have second jobs. And some of our members are at Cato, some of our members work at recovering Cato institutions like Niskanen. And so I think we would have spent half of our research time just debating one another as to whether the United States should intervene rather than getting right at the heart of the problem. So we adopted this assumption so that we kind of all agree to agree and then look at it. My personal view is I think that more likely than not, the United States is moving in the direction that you're suggesting. And in most conflict scenarios that I can imagine, I can't see how the United States would stay out of it and would lend support either material or otherwise. In that case, for all the reasons I think Eric aptly pointed out, I think that this posture or even a posture approximating it would make it easier for the United States to intervene and would make deterrence even more effective.
Awesome. Thank you.
The gentleman over here.
Hi, Dan Katz, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Of course, with any war, like political willpower as well as the support of the general population are going to be critical to maintaining any sort of action, especially with insurgency as to what's been proposed and talked about today. So what is the Taiwanese public opinion on that very matter? Is if China does invade, what's the public opinion? Yeah, what's the public opinion in terms of engaging in such actions?
This is where we need Eric.
Yeah, so unfortunately, our polling expert is teaching a class to undergraduates learning how to do polling right now. So I must on some level defer to her. She's been staying much more on top of public opinion polling. I am confident in saying that this particular question has not been posed for all sorts of very sound reasons. Would you wage an insurgency against an invasion force? However, there has been a lot more extensive polling on, willingness to fight. There does seem to be some profound concern. I, however, tend to agree with Mike on this issue. I think history of warfare tends to show that when you are attacked, a sizable part of your population is willing to fight. And I think that these concerns about people throwing down their weapons, to be sure, there will be people who throw down their weapons and don't fight, but that happens in the U.S. military in the past. It will probably happen, but I think a large cadre will fight, and I think one of the benefits of this asymmetric force posture, particularly if you focus on insurgency, territorial defense, guerrilla warfare, is that you don't need 2.5 million people to pick up arms. If you can even get a fraction of that, you've got a nasty dilemma that China's going to have to deal with. And more likely than not, if the history of conventional militaries fighting unconventional opponents says anything, they're going to take steps that actually inflame the insurgency, not tap it down. Unless they're willing to go scorched earth. I think if they go scorched earth, that creates all sorts of challenges with the international community that we're not, able to consider.
Scott, would that align with your observation of the
Yeah,
public opinion?
I agree that, and maybe Michael can add to this as well. But I mean, my sense is that, well, I mean, so you have some polling that's done on like, do you think Taiwan would fight? Would you fight? I don't recall. Like, I think it's a sizable percentage kind of suggests that they would fight, or that they believe that Taiwan would fight. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head. But I do think you have to take these sorts of opinion polls kind of with a large grain of salt, right? Because it's asking a hypothetical question, and it's just hard to know how that's gonna, it's kind of like questions, like sometimes you have like surveys done in the United States, like should the US support Taiwan, intervene in the Taiwan Strait if China attacks Taiwan? And you have like 70% say no, because they don't know anything about Taiwan, right? The average person knows zero about Taiwan. And so of course they're gonna say no. Why would the US get involved in another war, right? But if you actually have an invasion, and you have like the media focusing on it 24/7, right? And you have reports about Taiwan's democracy under attack, like people's opinions are gonna change. And so it's really hard to know what it's actually gonna look like in that kind of a scenario. And I think it's the same thing in Taiwan, right? If you do a poll, like would you fight if China attacks? Like it's one thing to kind of answer a poll question. It's another thing to like have missiles raining down, on your city, and how infuriated you're going to be about like your life being ruined, all right? So I think it's hard to draw too much inference from that.
I'm Janice. I work with Mike in the DPP mission, and so picking up on that and maybe trying to tie together some of the early questions about identity and polarization and this question of whether people are willing to fight. I think there is some more recent polling from this spring of just posing this question, and I think this is kind of a newer area of inquiry. So the polls that came out this year showed that it was about 66 to 70% of people said if China invades to implement unification, would you fight? And that was kind of the level. And then it changed a little bit if it's because Taiwan declares independence, and there's like different conditions on that. And it showed that that was especially strong for younger people. So I think there's not a long track record of this question being asked, but I think that's something we're going to be tracking going into the future. But I think the missing piece of this discussion that I think Mike tried to bring in a little bit is the question of identity. I'm glad that was evident to you when you were in Taiwan. That in fact I do believe that that's pretty much consolidated. That there's this Taiwanese identity. It's been going on for over a decade, and maybe the missing connection is, what does that mean in terms of, Michael Cole, one of the concepts that he came up with was also this idea of civic nationalism, right? So nationalism and being Taiwanese is not just about, it's about connection to the island of Taiwan and geographic, and it's, ROC because that's the name, but also the democratic institutions that have been developed, right? And a democratic way of life. And I think that's maybe something that's been a little bit missing in the discourse and the public debate about defense and about, cross-strait policy, right? So I think President Tsai is trying to do a little bit of this. If you look at her National Day address from a year ago, she did talk about, the military as the defender of our democratic way of life. And that's probably something that we need to be expanding more on. And that's the direction that we need to go. And then on the other end of that challenge is how do you sort of outfit and reformulate the way that the military thinks and operates to match that, right? To have that as their central mission. And as you alluded to, the Taiwan military, the ROC military has a lot of the U.S. in its DNA, basically, right? And there's a lot of historical links in the way that they train and the doctrine. So I think maybe going forward, another rich area of research, if there's PhD students looking for a dissertation, is, we have a lot of studies about capabilities and strategy, and this asymmetric path has been sketched out by, different think tanks and different researchers. But how do you actually implement that? What are studies on maybe like bureaucratic or organizational change that can be looked to? What are previous, analogs of this that might be helpful? in addition to, just tactics and doctrine and strategy.
So Alexander and I are working actually on that paper, so wait with bated breath.
Oh, when is the paper coming out?
Well, we got to finish it first.
Oh, okay.
We're working on the paper.
Okay, all right, look
But no,
forward to it.
these are very important questions, and we've recognized, and this is a challenge Poland is dealing with, Estonia is dealing with. A lot of countries are attempting this, but it's kind of very new territory.
Great. Launch your paper here next year. Do we have more questions? No? We're all good? Well, thank you very much for a very rich discussion. It's very informative and certainly raises a lot of good questions and for people to consider and good papers to be written. Please join me in thanking our speakers.